sound tidak sama dengan suara. Kali ini akan ngobrolin tentang sebuah topik yang menarik, saya pikir. Kita akan ngobrolin tentang beberapa genre musik dalam kaitannya dengan sejarah atau periode waktu tertentu, yaitu tahun 1997 sampai 2001. Kali ini saya mengundang seorang profesor. Beliau adalah profesor antropologi dari Bowling Green University di Ohio, Profesor Jeremy Wallach. Hi Jeremy, how are you?
I'm doing well, how are you?
Good, thank you. It's blazing outside. Jeremy, so we're going to talk a bit about your publication from 2008 entitled Modern Noise and Fluid Genres, which was translated into Bahasa Indonesia in 2017 as Musik Indonesia, Kebisingan dan Keberagaman Aliran Lagu. Now, this book came out from your research around the time of the political reform in Indonesia. So for the start, would you mind telling us about your experiences from the field around that time?
Well, the research for it was conducted right before and right after Reformasi. It wasn't considered safe to go while the revolution was happening. So I had a sort of before and after snapshot. And when I went back to Indonesia in 2017, it occurred to me that this was now important history. It wasn't history when I was doing the research, it was the present. But now this is an important historical document for when the Indonesian political scene was changing, but also when the music scene was changing. And I was looking at the role of music in that transition, but I was not primarily looking at politics. I was looking at the musical culture of the time, which was in this real state of creative ferment, really a state of creativity and experimentation and innovation. And one thing that I think has become clear in the subsequent years is that that period really had started before my research began, and which was in 1997, and really had started before the New Order really began to decline. It really was a boom in local music that started in the early 90s with the rise of the underground scene and the rise of alternative rock and bands inspired by the things they were seeing on MTV. The rise of rock bands and pop bands that sang in Indonesian that were inspired by groups like U2 and REM and Metallica and Green Day, and were interested in combining that sound with the very long and proud tradition of socially conscious popular music, groups like Slank and Awan Falls, that was already there, that was already present in the region, and groups like God Bless. And this was sort of the new wave of Indonesian popular music, and they were taking new genres and using that to carry on this popular music tradition of Indonesian rock and pop that had begun in the 60s.
Well, the 1990s was considered as the time when political activism was growing in the late New Order, but it's also a time when Indonesian popular music entered a new phase with the establishment of television stations, private television stations. Of course, the radios was already there. Various music programs on TV. MTV was there. So, in your own words, how would you describe the music scene at that time?
Well, it was a time, particularly right around the fall of New Order. Uh, it was a time where there was a lot of euphoria, a lot of excitement about what might happen, even in the sort of mainstream music industry. Uh, the thought that really the music consumer was going to be more interested in new sounds, and also there was a euphoric feeling in the underground too. The idea that you didn't have to sell out necessarily, that this was a time when you were now free to do what you wanted to do. You didn't have to worry about making music that was too political, terlalu tajam, too sharp. And there was a lot of really great political music against the New Order that came out after the New Order fell, because it was then safe to do it. And even, anti-New Order songs in Indonesian, which were relatively unusual before the fall of the New Order, but they were relatively safe to do after Suharto was gone. So you had this sort of an explosion of locally produced independent music. And something else that happened was the Krismon. And that meant that you couldn't get imported music anymore, particularly imported underground music, because you had to pay regular price for that, everyone else, through the tape trading network had to pay for. And it became really too expensive. So it was much more economical to make your own cassettes and sell those. And so there was this real explosion, a real period of tremendous creativity and tremendous productivity in both the underground and mainstream music industries. And the music industries began to realize there was so much going on in the underground that very soon they started signing the most successful of the underground groups. And of course, this is exactly what happened everywhere else, that the most successful, most innovative of the underground groups became major label phenomena, with very few exceptions. You have bands like, in America, you have Fugazi and the Dead Kennedys, and in Indonesia, you had Pupin, right? Bands that refused to go to major labels, or like Homicide, right? But, for the most part, you had bands that crossed over and went to larger commercial labels, like Superman is Dead, right? Goes to Sony, right? And really increases the range of listeners. But it's, from the perspective of a popular music scholar, it's part of the ecosystem. Some bands do decide to become major label bands, and there are reasons for that. And not all the reasons are bad. What has happened in Indonesia is that there are bands that produce music that is so uncommercial that it's unlikely they'll ever attract the attention of a label like Sony, right? I mean, now, really important bands in the Indonesian underground would be, there would be a band like Senyawa, for example.
Yeah.
They're not going to go on Sony. That I think the scene has evolved so that most of the really important bands are playing stuff that's really out there, really experimental. But certain bands, I think, by going to a major label, they increase the power of what they do, and it's sort of a compromise. I mean, was it wrong for Rage Against the Machine to go to a major label? Was it wrong for Green Day to go to a major label? Was it wrong for Nirvana to go to a major label? Well, maybe, but would there have been such a big punk scene in Indonesia if those bands hadn't gone to a major label? Because that helped them get here, or anywhere else around the world. That they got that major label support, and it didn't necessarily change the music all that much. So from the perspective of someone observing this stuff, it's complicated. From the perspective of someone inside the scene, those bands sold out. I remember someone told me, jangan boycott, lebih baik bajak. that was about Rage Generation Brothers. No one remembers them now, but they actually signed to a major label before Superman is Dead. They were a punk band. And he was saying, for those of you who don't speak Indonesian, don't boycott, just pirate it, right? Just get an illegal copy and you don't give the major label money. And, you know, there are various ways to negotiate, right, that transition from independent to major label. It's, I think from the perspective of someone looking at the social impact of popular music, it's not always a bad thing, but it often, you know, comes with its own costs. But also its benefits, right, to engage with the wider music market, right, to move out of a small network of local scenes. The thing is that network is transnational, and you can do a lot just staying independent, and so it's a trade-off. And one of the big trade-offs is you're never going to be economically self-sufficient if you stay indie, right? If you stay underground, there are certain things you can't do, and one of the things you can't do really is make a living, and that becomes a problem, right, once you're over 35. And you know, your 20-year-old fans aren't going to understand that, but you know, when you're over 35, you kind of need to do something.
Yeah, that reminds me of how bands go a long way to producing their music and also distributing them. But this ties to a chapter in your book where you looked at cassette retail shops and how those cassettes of different genres are displayed and, you know, with different prices and classifying them. It seems that foreign cassettes were more expensive than, let's say, pop Indonesia or dangdut, right? Can you talk a bit more about that?
The point of that chapter was to show the official kind of hierarchy of popular music. And a lot of the rest of the book is how that hierarchy is kind of deconstructed in a lot of other contexts, right, outside the record store. But the official hierarchy kind of places imported music on top. It's not really imported music. It's music that is licensed, right? It's produced in Indonesia, so it's still cheaper than it would be if it was actually imported. Imported records are very expensive. As you know, I mean, if you get actual imports, they're, you know, mahal sekali.
Yeah.
But then there's imported music that's produced in Indonesia, but that's still very expensive compared to Indonesian music. And then dangdut is really cheap. And then music that's from India is usually as expensive as dangdut because it appeals to the same audience. So you have this sort of hierarchy that's correlated with how much something costs. And that's sort of the official hierarchy of musical taste. And what's interesting is the music that is most highly valued by Americans would be the sort of authentic traditional music. And that is the same price as dangdut. You know, musik daerah, right, is very inexpensive because the assumption in Indonesia is only the orang kampungan, right, want to listen to them.
Xenocentrism in that chapter, does it mean that, you know, Western pop music is valued more than like local Indonesian music?
From what I understand, it's still the case, but it's less salient than it was. That Indonesian music that uses Western ideas is much more important now than it was 20 years ago. That people are fans of Indonesian music that don't know anything about Western music and don't really care about it. So that's something that's changed. Mm-hmm. In 2000, it was less like that. There was much more anxiety about whether Indonesian music might measure up or not. And that's, I think, I talk about that, but in the book, but that's changed. That's changed because Indonesian music that has, you know, that's been modeled on those templates has been around for so long, has a long history.
Of course, there's a long history of Indonesian popular music. You get names like, Kos Plus, Lili Suryani, Titik Puspa in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But I think it goes further back than that, 1920s, I think. But anyway, one of the things that I find interesting from the book was this idea of bands or musicians, Indonesian musicians, singing in English. So, you propose this idea of singing in English as authentic, whereas older ethnomusicology would discuss that as appropriation. So how do you see Indonesian bands singing in English as authentic?
What I was concerned with is I didn't want to talk about authenticity in terms of how observers from the outside might think about it, right? It didn't seem like it was productive to focus on how scholars might value that as a sort of pre-existing notion that they come in with. It seemed like what mattered was what the people doing the music valued. And what I realized is that there are all different kinds of authenticity, and it's kind of used as a way to justify your own kind of aesthetics. So authenticity claims are not necessarily good to take seriously at face value, but also what I found is that people who performed in English in Indonesia, and in 2000, people didn't know English. I mean, even people with your education had a lot of problems. They had a lot of difficulty communicating in English. I was lucky because there are American anthropologists who are younger than me who have trouble using Indonesian because everyone they talked to there knew English really well. But that's because they went to Indonesia after me.
Right.
Like in 2000, it was not a language. The education system was different. People knew they were supposed to know it, but they were uncomfortable. Lebih nyaman pakai Indonesia aja. But they sang in English anyway. And the reason why they did that was they wanted to be authentic to the genre that they were doing. So it was their definition of authenticity that was more important than someone from the outside saying, well, they're not singing their own language. This isn't authentic. Well, but that doesn't matter. What matters is this is how they perform authenticity as a punk. This is the language the Sex Pistols and the Clash sang in. This is the language they want to sing in. And when Rage Generation Brothers, was signed by a major label, they insisted we have to have some songs in English because we want to sing in English. This is what punk is supposed to be sung in. I talked to a punk who said, Indonesian is for dangdut. I don't want to sing in Indonesian. I want to sing in English. Well, that's an authenticity argument, but that's being authentic to punk as a genre, as opposed to being an authentic Indonesian, whatever that means. That doesn't mean anything, right? I mean, because you're in Indonesia, of course you're an authentic Indonesian. I mean, what else would you be? So that's something from the outside, right? That makes no sense, right? That's only if you're an outsider does that make any sense at all to think about. So it makes no sense. It's irrelevant. And if I had stuck to those kinds of judgment calls, I don't think anyone would have been interested in translating my book because it would have been irrelevant. I tried not to take that perspective.
Well, the book is so popular. It's read by many Indonesians, not just scholars. A lot of my friends read that. And of course, like the subject of the study, rock music, metal, pop music are considered as popular. But what is the significance of the popular? I mean, why are you doing this? What is with the popular?
Well, I'm in a department of popular culture, so I have many thoughts on this. I think about the popular all the time, what it means, how it occupies this space between the folk and the classical, right, high culture and folk culture. Uh, and, in some ways, folk culture is popular culture, the culture of the people. And one of the things that I wanted to do when I went to Indonesia, I wanted to study the music that people actually listen to, as opposed to the music that people went to Indonesia to study from the outside. And one thing I realized being in Jakarta, which is a place that nobody wanted to go to, right? I mean, most people go to Indonesia, they fly to Jakarta and they immediately leave, right? They want to go to Jogja, they want to go to Solo. Some people want to go to Bandung. No one wants to stay in Jakarta. And when I would go to Jakarta and, ask people, what should I study? They would say, well, don't stay here, go study the gamelan, go study Wan Kulit. But they would also say that, well, yeah, gamelan, that's not Indonesian music. That's Javanese music, that's Balinese music, that's music ethnic, that's ethnic music. And in Ohio where I teach, gamelan is Indonesian music, and they don't know anything else unless they take a class with me and I teach them about dangdut and I teach them about metal and hardcore. But most other places, gamelan is Indonesian music. I was interested in popular music. I was interested in what I'd heard about dangdut and rock and pop, and mostly by reading Philip Yampolsky's work and a few other people, William Frederick, Martin Hatch. There wasn't much, but I was intrigued by this, and I thought, well, what do people actually listen to in Indonesia as opposed to the gamelan stuff? And does the gamelan stuff affect the popular music stuff? That was sort of what I was interested in. And does it affect the metal? Because I knew that metal was really big, and I was interested in metal and punk. And now more than ever, it seems to, it really does. It more than it did then. I mean, back then, other than like Kremush and Eternal Madness, there wasn't much gamelan metal. Now there's all kinds of gamelan metal. Just every kind of form you can think of. Really neat stuff. So I think there really aren't a lot of, easy boundaries to point to between the folk, the popular, and the sort of classical, especially in Indonesia, but really anywhere. And no one was writing about it.
Yeah, the metal scene in Indonesia is pretty big. It's big. In another of your publication entitled "Metal Rules the Globe," it's an inquiry of the metal scene across the globe.
Yeah.
So, how do you see Indonesia's metal scene within this global network of metalheads?
Well, it's interesting because I got interested in sort of the global dimensions of metal because of Indonesia, obviously. And in doing that research and doing the Metal Rules the Globe research, I learned that Indonesia was actually unusual because it was such a big scene. It's less like most other Asian countries except for Japan, and more like Latin America, in that it's seen as very large and has been there a long time. Most other scenes in Asia are newer and smaller. But it is a global phenomenon, and it's growing. It's not that popular a genre in America anymore, especially among young people. But in other places, it's very popular and it's growing, particularly in some countries, not others. And why that is not entirely clear. But right now, there are growing scenes in Africa. There are scenes that are growing in Latin America and also Asia. The scenes seem to be growing there. In Indonesia, it's already pretty big. It may be shrinking a little bit, but it's still very, very big. There seem to be more and more bands on YouTube now. And I think probably now they're getting more international recognition, I think now more than ever. So I think probably that'll have an effect as well. When I was doing my research, nobody, it seemed, knew about the Indonesian metal scene, even in the sort of metal world, which I thought was surprising. I mean, even, in the early 2000s, people didn't seem to know, not even like, internationally touring bands. By the end of the 2000s, internationally touring bands started to learn about how many people you could play in front of in Indonesia. By the time Sam Dunn did his global metal film, people knew about it. Sam Dunn got in touch with me to ask about the Indonesian metal scene. And then Iron Maiden went to play in 2011. He played Jakarta and Bali. So it all sort of started happening about 10 years ago. But before that, it sort of happened, on its own, just like the punk scene. It sort of was people hearing the records and making their own sort of interpretations of them stick and sort of building a culture from that, which is fascinating.
So, popular music studies, what you are doing now, I find that in Indonesia it's growing. It is taught in institutions, applied through different departments, namely sociology, anthropology, but also English. How do you see in the future popular music studies? I mean, what do you advocate if this was to be addressed to young researchers?
That's a very good question, and not an easy one, because as you said, I might have some actual recognition in those circles. That sounds like. I would say that this is really important work, really crucial, and I think it really can help us answer some important questions that the social theory, the economic theory, the political science theories that we have addressed inadequately, right? One of the things that that's important to remember about the political transition since 1998 in Indonesia, particularly the fact that the transition to democracy was successful. There was no real, there were no tools to predict it. American political scientists, even American anthropologists, they didn't believe it was possible. They might say in hindsight, well, we saw it coming, the New Order was on its way out. It was, looking at its own demise. And of course, the economic crisis was, its end, and, it lost its legitimacy. I was there in 1997. You were, nobody thought Suharto was going anywhere. He was overthrown by this grassroots movement, and we don't have an explanation for it, right, with the theories that we have, right? The power of popular culture to change people's minds, to get them to act, is not something that's well understood.
Right.
It's not something that we have the tools as scholars to really understand. We need more research. We need more people to take things like music and film and media seriously, to understand how it contributes to the history of a nation. So this is really important research that people are doing. And, it's important that Indonesians do it. I mean, because they know a lot more than I do. I mean, I was just starting off. I was hoping to start off a conversation. What I did was very preliminary.
Let's go back a bit to the talk on the regime, the political regime. As you know, that the legacy of the New Order are still very much present. How do you see that?
Well, one of the things that I think is really strange that, again, this is maybe is my perspective as an outsider, the desire to bureaucratize everything. That seems to be sort of a New Order trait. So, when I met a black metal band, in rural Java, he had, the guitarist had these trophies for like best underground band. In America, if you're in a black metal band, you don't have trophies for being the best band. Even if you are a good band, you don't have like
Right.
competitions, right? And I was reading about Reak in Bandung, the Jalanan Bandung, and they've decided, even though they have, autonomy sekarang, but they have, you have to register now, if you're an Reak ensemble, and, you have to register, and then the people from outside Bandung don't count. And, you have to, be officially recognized as true Reak. And, instead of being this kind of disorganized, kasar kind of art form, you have to be sort of regimented.
How do you see the political scene has changed since the 1990s? Because you were back in Indonesia, right, in 2017?
It's hard to say. I mean, things have changed a lot, but certain things, I think things that people don't necessarily dwell on, they aren't conscious of, haven't changed. But I think things have gotten more contestatory. People are weighing the two things, that are sort of mixed, right? There's, on the one hand, ideas about women's roles that are from feminism, and ideas about gender equality. On the other hand, there's this thing called state egoism, right? The idea that women have a certain role and they should do this. And now people are thinking about those two things, right? But they're both still there. The idea that we should have pembangunan all the time, we should always have modernization and development, but maybe not. Maybe we should be more self-sufficient. Maybe we should not screw over farmers all the time. That those exist now in tension with each other. There's more open discourse about them. But the idea of developmentalism is still there. It hasn't gone away, right? So the ideologies of the New Order are still there, but they're not the only game in town. It's not a monologue. There's a conversation and an argument. I guess that's what I would say.
Well, you talked about the current trends or what can be done in popular music studies in an article that you wrote with Esther Clinton. There's a lot of things there. You talk about Marx, you talk about power, the post-colonial world. Do you foresee that kind of scholarship done by Indonesian young scholars in talking about popular music in Indonesia?
I hope so, yes. Yes. The point of writing that was to get everyone kind of on the same page in a sense. This is what has been done in the field, which means that a whole lot more needs to be done still. And I think that ethnomusicology has entered a more global era, where I think the conversation has to be opened up to more voices. And we need to understand the history that we all share. And it is a history that is characterized by structural inequality, but it's also a history that's characterized by increasing interconnectedness.
Right.
Our scholarship should be informed by both those realizations. And that is, I think, what the chapter contributes. It's sort of a baseline, because a lot of the people who are reading that chapter are going to be Americans or people in American graduate programs. But those people in those programs are going to come from a lot of places. And we wanted the chapter to make sense for all those people. A lot of the chapter really came from our experiences teaching international students. So we wanted to write something really for them. And hopefully it puts things, in a way, where you have all these ideas in one place. You can look at them critically and sort of look at them together, and sort of see where we're at.
Right.
It's supposed to be a launching off point.
Well, I think it's a brilliant launch. I hope that people can reflect on that. Now, what about music? I mean, what kind of stuff you listen to now? I mean, for the past decade or so, are there any particular bands or music that you listen to frequently?
Well, I do listen to a lot of Indonesian music. Seringai, Demon's Dam, Siksa Kubur, Senyawa, Dead Squad, old bands.
I remember in Cornell 2018, you talked a bit about Voice of the Baceprot.
Oh, Baceprot.
How do you find VOB?
Oh, I think they're great. I mean,
talk about skill.
Oh yeah, their bassist is amazing. I think they're great. I mean, obviously it's a human interest story. It really took a long time for the metal press in America, in the West, to actually write a story about them. It took until like this year. It was originally sort of a human interest story, and the Western sort of general mass media reported them first because of the fact that they wore the hijab and they were young. And but I like their music. I think it's cool. But yeah, they're still in school and they don't have that many songs. I liked that they added a track to the Tolak RI Permusikan compilation. I thought that was great. Yeah, they're very well exposed, but yeah, I think they're cool. I haven't met them. And I do listen to them too. Oh, Burgerkill, of course. I saw them in Dayton,
right,
in Ohio. And who else? Not just metal bands. I mean, I still listen to Evi Tamala and Rome Rama and Iestalia and Stars and Rabbit. Very interesting. Cherry Bombshell, of course.
All right, yeah.
They really hold up. They really do. Homogenic. These are a lot of them were just old because I'm old.
You mentioned Senyawa. What do you think about them?
I think they're really neat. I like them. I really just discovered them. I always knew about them, but I haven't listened to them very much until recently. What I didn't understand about Senyawa is I'm corresponding now with an Italian anthropologist, and I'm just finding out how popular Senyawa really is. That among Asian and European experimental musicians, they're very well known.
They're always on the road, I remember wanting to meet Ruli or Wukir, but they're only back in Indonesia for a few days and then they're off again. But mainly in Europe and Asia. Only a few people in the US know them.
Yeah, I didn't know this. I thought, no, it's a weird band in Indonesia. Nobody knows about them. No, everyone knows about them, but Americans.
Well, we've been talking about the music scene, and we can talk more, but once again, there's a limitation of time. So, Professor Jeremy Wallach, thank you very much.
Sama-sama.
It's a privilege to be able to talk with you.
Yeah.
Demikian tadi bincang-bincang bersama Profesor Jeremy Wallach. Kami akhiri dengan Bung Aryan nih, sama teman-teman, Seringai, dan yang ini berjudul Selamanya.
Selamat datang di Wahana Pesta Seringai.